He was 24 years old, and he had just been asked not to tell anyone what he had built, not to destroy it, not to bury the paperwork, just to keep it to himself. The company he worked for made something that almost every household on Earth bought, used up, and bought again. Its yellow packaging was recognized in places where people could not read the letters printed on it. Within a decade, it would employ more than 145,000 people around the world, and 60,000 in its own city alone. The company was Eastman Kodak. About 20 years after that conversation, Kodak was worth roughly $31 billion. 15 years after that, it entered bankruptcy protection, owing close to $7 billion. Most people have heard the short version. Kodak invented the digital camera, refused to sell it, and was killed by its own invention. That account is tidy, which is why it has lasted. It is also wrong in the ordinary way, by taking one true fact and asking it to carry everything. The number of photographs of ordinary people that exist because of this single company is not something I can hold in my head, and I have stopped trying. This is also the company that worked out where the fallout from the first atomic bomb test had traveled, and kept that to itself. It processed the film that American spy planes and satellites brought back from over the Soviet Union. Weapons-grade uranium sat beneath one of its plants for more than 30 years, without ever being announced. And for 57 years after its founder was dead, it ran on a calendar he had adopted, one that gave the year 13 months. The founder is the other half of this. He left school before he was 15 to support his mother and his sisters. There was never a wife, and there were never any children. He gave away most of a very large fortune while he was still alive, much of it without letting his name be used. He also worked to one principle. Whatever his company was selling, he was already building the thing that would make it worthless. His successors inherited the factories, and they inherited the calendar. The habit of mind did not come with them. Chapter 1. The Camera in the Closet. The object on the workbench weighed about 8 pounds and was roughly the size of a toaster. The lens had been taken off a home movie camera. Behind it sat a light sensor smaller than a fingernail. 16 batteries, 6 circuit boards, wired by hand. There was no word for what it was because nothing like it existed. The man who built it was called Stephen Sasson. He had joined Kodak in 1973, straight out of graduate school, and he was an awkward fit from the start. Kodak hired chemists. Kodak hired mechanical engineers. Cameras were machines and film was chemistry, and nobody was entirely sure what an electrical engineer was for. In 1974, his supervisor handed him a question rather than a project. A company called Fairchild had produced a new component that turned light into electrical signal. Could one of those be used to capture a picture? Sasson was given almost no budget and almost no supervision. He has said since that he spent much of that year wondering why on earth he had agreed to it. By December of 1975, it worked, after a fashion. On the 12th of that month, he asked a lab technician named Joy Marshall to sit for him. The exposure itself was quick. What came afterwards was not. The machine needed about 23 seconds to write the picture onto a cassette tape, one line at a time. Then the tape had to be carried across to a second device, which read it back and put it on a television screen. The picture measured 100 pixels across and 100 down. In modern terms, 1/100th of a megapixel. It was black and white, and it was barely a face. But nothing had touched it. No silver, no gelatin, no chemistry of any kind had gone anywhere near it. There was no negative and nothing to develop. The image existed as numbers. Over the following months, Sasson demonstrated the machine to groups of Kodak executives. He has described the reaction as curiosity mixed with unease, and the questions he remembers were practical. When would it be ready? Why would anyone want to look at photographs on a television set? Who exactly was asking for this? Read now, those questions sound absurd. In 1975, they were the correct questions to ask, and the men asking them had a great deal riding on the answers. Kodak did not make its money from cameras. It made its money from what cameras used up. A camera sold once, film sold forever, and then it was developed, and then it was printed, and every one of those steps came back to Rochester. In 1976, the company held around 90% of film sales in the United States and about 85% of camera sales. The plants, the laboratories, the photo counter, and every drugstore in America, all of it rested on a single assumption. Taking a picture requires something you have to buy again. Sasson had built a camera that used nothing up. Nobody in those rooms laughed at him. I find that harder to forgive than mockery would have been. Nobody told him to stop either. That is the part people get wrong. He was allowed to carry on, and he did carry on for years. What he was asked was smaller and more corrosive than a ban. He was asked not to talk about it outside the company, so he did not. The most consequential object Kodak produced in the second half of the century sat inside its own laboratories, held by the people best equipped to understand it. The world was not told. The patent came through in 1978. It described a filmless camera in plain language, and it belonged entirely to Eastman Kodak. It expired in 1995, at almost exactly the moment the rest of the world worked out what it was for. Chapter 2. The company that kept its own calendar. If you drove the length of it, you were driving for almost 4 miles. Kodak Park sat on the northern edge of Rochester, New York, and by the middle of the 20th century, it covered well over 1,000 acres. More than 150 manufacturing buildings stood on the site. 30 miles of paved road connected them. Company locomotives worked the loading docks along miles of private track. Electricity and steam came from generating plants inside the fence. Water and sewage were handled there too. The fire brigade belonged to the company, crewed by men trained on company hazards. Film was made from materials that burned in ways a municipal service was not equipped for. The buildings were not named, they were numbered. Kodak Park had opened in 1890 on a plot of about 16 acres. Eastman went north because he needed room, and because he had understood something his competitors had not. Film was a chemical process at industrial scale. Whoever could make it most consistently, in the largest volume, at the lowest cost, would take the market and hold it. At its height, the site employed more than 15,000 people, and from 1928, all of it kept time by a calendar that existed nowhere else in the country. The idea had not been Eastman's. It belonged to a British accountant named Moses Cotsworth, who had spent years working for a railway and had grown irritated by something anyone who compares monthly figures will recognize. The months are not equal. February is not March. A month with 5 Saturdays in it does not sell like a month with 4, so comparing one against the next tells you very little. Cotsworth's answer was to make them equal. 13 months in the year, 28 days in each, every month beginning on a Sunday and ending on a Saturday, permanently, in every year that would follow. The 13th sat between June and July and was called Sol. That left the year a day short, so one was added at the end and belonged to no month at all. To a man running a manufacturing operation the size of Kodak, this was not a curiosity. It was an instrument. Eastman adopted it in 1928 and put the entire company on it. Payroll went on to the new months, and so did the accounts. Every internal report Kodak produced from then on carried a date that meant nothing to anyone outside the gates. Eastman died in 1932. The calendar outlasted him by 57 years. It was still in use in 1989. By then, Kodak was competing against Japanese manufacturers and losing, and had been warned in writing about a digital future it chose not to prepare for. The internal documents recording that decline were dated in a system devised by a railway accountant and adopted by a man who had been dead for most of a century. The odd thing is how warmly the people who used it still talk about it. I had expected to find someone who thought it was absurd. None of them were troubled by the arithmetic. The months were even, the comparisons were honest, and after a while you stopped translating and simply thought in 13s. It worked. That was the whole argument for it. And inside the fence it was enough. He chose it in 1928, they let it go in 1989. Chapter 3. What Kodak knew and never said. The film that should have been blank was coming back marked. It began in the late summer of 1945 at the Rochester plant. Sheets of X-ray film, unexposed and still sealed, were developing patterns when they should have shown nothing. The fault was called fogging. It was an ordinary problem with an unusual number of possible causes, and the company worked backwards through all of them. The emulsion was not at fault. Neither were the machines that coated it. It was the cardboard. The film had been packed in strawboard from a mill in Vincennes, Indiana. The mill drew its water from a river. Something upstream had gone into that water, and it was now sitting in the packaging and exposing the film from the outside in. A company scientist named Webb took the problem apart. What he identified in the board was a fission product, which does not occur in nature and which no industrial process makes. In 1945, there was exactly one way for it to exist. Webb went carefully and slowly. He was in contact with the laboratory at Los Alamos within 2 years. When he finally published in 1949, he set it down without hedging. The contamination had come from the atomic test carried out in New Mexico in July of 1945. Fallout from Trinity had crossed most of a continent and entered the water supply of an Indiana paper mill. From there, it went into the packaging, and the packaging went to a film factory in New York State. Kodak fitted air samplers to its ventilation intakes and said nothing publicly for 4 years. Testing moved to Nevada. On the 27th of January, 1951, the first device there was detonated. Days later, it snowed on the plant, 1,600 miles away, and a counter read more than 25 times the normal level. Snow that should have measured a few hundred counts a minute was measuring 10,000. Kodak took the matter to the Atomic Energy Commission directly, and again through the trade body representing photographic manufacturers. The commission agreed to help, not by stopping and not by telling the country. What it offered was advance notice to the photographic industry, covering when tests would happen and where the fallout was likely to drift. Manufacturers could move stock and shield their packaging accordingly. The people living under the drift were told nothing. It would be easy to make Kodak the villain of that arrangement, and I am not sure that is right. A company asked a government agency to stop ruining its product, and the agency answered the question it had been asked. Nobody at a film factory had the authority to declassify a weapons program. What is true regardless is that for most of that decade an industry knew when the fallout was coming, and the families underneath it did not. By then the company was doing work for the government that went considerably further than complaining. In the spring of 1956, it set up a covert processing center in a Navy-owned building on the west side of the city. Equipment was pulled from across the company and installed there. The purpose was film from the U-2, the aircraft photographing the Soviet Union from 60,000 feet. The operation outgrew that building. It moved to Kodak's Hawkeye plant, where Driving Park Avenue crosses the gorge of the Genesee River, and inside the intelligence community, it was called Bridgehead. Something like 1,400 people worked there at its height. When the satellites came, the film came north too. Corona capsules were ejected in orbit and fell through the atmosphere, where aircraft trailing hooks caught them in mid-air. The film was flown to New York State and driven to the plant in an unmarked truck. Kodak also built the cameras for Gambit, the high-resolution system that photographed Soviet missile sites. Those cameras were designed and manufactured in the same city that developed their pictures. The Secretary of Defense is reported to have visited in person in the autumn of 1967, unannounced. Then, in 1974, the company installed something beneath one of its buildings. It was not a reactor, whatever has been written since. What sat down there was a device no bigger than a refrigerator, producing a beam of neutrons that could be used to examine materials without damaging them. To multiply those neutrons, it used a lattice of highly enriched uranium, about 3.5 pounds of it, the same material, in the same form, that goes into weapons. It sat under Building 82 in a purpose-built labyrinth behind 2 feet of reinforced concrete with 8 feet of earth above it. The device was licensed and it never leaked. The uranium went back to the federal government in 2007. The city found out in 2012 when a former employee mentioned it to the local newspaper. The police had not known. The fire service had not known. Kodak's own spokesman said afterwards that he could find no record of the company ever announcing it. Chapter 4: The Bank Clerk Who Bet Everything. By the spring of 1882, the money was gone, and George Eastman had spent it undoing his own work. His company was less than 2 years old. It made photographic plates, and the plates had stopped working. Dealers who had bought stock found it produced nothing when developed, or something faint and useless, and they wrote to Rochester to say so. He had two options and could afford one of them. He could argue. Dry plates were a young product, dealers stored them badly, and any manufacturer of the period could have pointed at handling or at temperature or at the customer. Instead, he took every bad plate back and replaced it at his own cost, without establishing whose fault it was. It emptied the business. The contractor putting up his new premises threatened to foreclose. Eastman said afterwards that the replacements had taken the last dollar the company had, and that he considered it a fair exchange, because what he still owned was a reputation. Then he had to find out what had gone wrong, and he could not. Through that winter he ran experiment after experiment on the emulsion, and nothing held. The number usually given is 469 failed attempts. I cannot verify it. I can only imagine being somewhere around the 300th and still going. In March, he and his partner Henry Strong boarded a steamer for England, where the raw material came from. It took about a week, and what they found was not in the formula. The supplier had changed where it sourced its gelatin. Nobody had mentioned it. Emulsion depended on gelatin. Gelatin came from cattle, and the behavior of the gelatin depended on what the cattle had been eating. The English firm had switched to a new source without telling anyone, because from where they stood, nothing had changed. It was still gelatin. It reportedly took another 40 years before anyone at the company worked out what the difference actually was. The explanation that has stood since is that the new animals had not grazed on enough of a particular sulfur-bearing plant. He had nearly lost everything over what some cows in England were fed. 5 years earlier, none of it had existed. In 1877, Eastman was a clerk at the Rochester Savings Bank, keeping careful account of other people's money and being paid a middle-class salary for it. He was good at the work, and he had no obvious reason to leave. That year, he planned a trip to Santo Domingo to look at land, and a colleague suggested he photograph what he found. So he bought the equipment. Photography in 1877 did not fit in a bag. The camera was the size of a small piece of furniture and needed a tripod built to carry it. A tent came too, because the plate had to be coated with chemicals, exposed, and developed before it dried, which meant the darkroom traveled with the photographer. Add the silver nitrate, the glass, and a jug of water for washing. Eastman called the whole outfit a pack horse load. He paid just under $50 for it, a figure he recorded to the cent because he recorded everything to the cent. He never made the trip. What he did instead was subscribe to a British photographic journal, and in the first issue that reached him, he read about a new process. Plates could be coated in advance with an emulsion set in gelatin and then stored dry. The photographer could carry them into the field and use them whenever he liked. Developing could wait until he was home. Everything in the pack horse load became unnecessary at once. For 3 years he worked at the bank by day and on emulsions at night, in his mother's kitchen. He taught himself from journals and from 2 local photographers willing to answer questions. There was also a chemist in Philadelphia who received letter after letter until he began answering properly. His mother found him asleep on the kitchen floor more than once. Hundreds of amateurs across 2 continents were doing something similar that decade. Almost none of them became anything. Eastman was not trying to make better photographs, he was trying to make plates in quantity. In 1880, he patented not just a formula, but a machine that coated plates evenly, in numbers, without a skilled hand at the bench. He rented a room above a music shop on State Street and began producing. A local businessman named Henry Strong, who had made his money manufacturing buggy whips, looked at the operation and put money into it. They formed a partnership on the 1st of January, 1881. Eastman held on to the bank job for most of that year in case. 14 months later, the plates failed. He was not a wealthy man protecting a fortune when he chose to absorb that entire loss. A former bank clerk with a defensible argument had simply declined to make it. What he bought with the last of the money was the only thing a maker of technical goods really owns, which is the customer's assumption that the box will work. Chapter 5. The Word That Did Not Exist. $1. That was the price of the Kodak Brownie when it reached shops in 1900. A roll of film for it cost 15 cents. The camera was a cardboard box covered in imitation leather, with a simple lens and a shutter, and it was sold to children. Reportedly more than 100,000 went in the first year. 12 years before, the word on the box had not existed. In 1888, Eastman needed one for a new product, and he rejected every option that meant something. A word describing photography was out. So was a family name over the door, which was the ordinary practice of the century, and so was anything a customer might confuse with a rival. So he built a word from nothing. He liked the letter K and said it struck him as a strong and incisive sort of letter. Working through combinations that began and ended with it, he tested each against 4 conditions. It had to be short. Nobody could mispronounce it. It should resemble no other word in use. And it should mean absolutely nothing in any language on earth. Kodak. He registered it as a trademark that year, and chose the yellow to go with it. The product it went on was a wooden box about as big as a shoebox. There was no viewfinder. You pointed it in approximately the right direction and pressed a button. Inside sat a roll of film long enough for 100 exposures, already loaded, and the customer was not expected to touch it. It cost $25, which was serious money. When the 100 pictures were used up, the owner did not open the camera. Opening it would have destroyed everything inside. What you did instead was wrap up the camera, the whole camera, and post it away. And then wait. Some weeks later, a parcel arrived containing your photographs, your negatives, and your camera loaded and ready to go again. Everything that had ever made photography difficult was still happening. It was simply happening somewhere the customer would never see, to somebody the customer would never meet. The pictures came back round. The lens was poor at the edges, so the image was printed as a circle about 2.5 inches across. That hid the flaw, and it gave the first decade of amateur photography a look of its own. Eastman wrote the advertising himself. The line he built the campaign on told the customer that they pressed the button, and the company handled everything after that. Within a year, people were saying it back to him in the street. My guess is that he understood exactly what he was building, because those advertisements are not modest. Before 1888, a photograph was something you sat for. It happened in a studio, in your best clothes, at a price, and there were not many of them in a life. Photography belonged to professionals and to serious amateurs with money and patience. After 1888, a photograph was something that happened to you while you were doing something else. 5,000 cameras sold in the first 6 months, mostly to people comfortable enough to spend that kind of money on an amusement. Then the price began to fall, because Eastman kept pushing it down, and each time it fell, a new group of people arrived who had never owned a camera before. In 1892, the business took the name of its own product and became the Eastman Kodak Company. And then came the dollar. The Brownie was not a better camera than the one before it. It was a worse one, deliberately, because the point was the price. At $1, it sat inside the reach of a working family, and at 15 cents a roll, the film was not a decision anybody had to think about. The number of photographs in the world stopped depending on how many professionals there were. What he had manufactured in 1888 was not a camera. It was a word that meant nothing, and he then spent 12 years filling it. Chapter 6. The Man He Fired on New Year's Day. The patent on the film that made Kodak possible was not issued in George Eastman's name. It went to a chemist called Henry Reichenbach in December of 1889, and Eastman withdrew his own competing application to let it through. Reichenbach had been hired 3 years earlier. He was young and locally trained, working as an assistant at the University of Rochester, and somebody there put his name forward when Eastman went looking. It was an unusual move for a manufacturer of that size. Eastman was among the first American industrialists to put a full-time research chemist on the payroll, and he did it before he could comfortably afford one. The brief was narrow: improve the emulsion, and find something to replace paper as a base for the film. Paper was the weak point in the entire system. Early roll film was coated onto paper, which meant the image had to be stripped from its backing after development, and the results were poor. Every serious photographer said so. What was needed was a base that was transparent, flexible, tough, and chemically inert, and nobody had made one. Reichenbach found it in celluloid. He worked out a formula using nitrocellulose dissolved in wood alcohol, poured across long glass tables so the solvent could evaporate and leave a clear sheet behind. It bent without breaking, and it held an image cleanly, and it would turn out to be the material motion pictures were made from for the next 100 years. By the early 1890s, Reichenbach was running Kodak Park, with a second chemist named Carl Passavant brought in beneath him. Nobody in the company mattered more to what it actually sold. Then, at the end of 1891, Eastman discovered that Reichenbach, Passavant, and a third employee were preparing to leave and set up in competition. He dismissed all three. The order took effect with the turn of the year, on the first day of 1892. Reichenbach and Passavant went ahead anyway, and founded the Photo Materials Company, staffed with former Eastman men. It sank without trace. The chemist who had built the film base for the largest photographic company in the world spent the rest of his career in obscurity. The record of him thins out and stops. A year later, Eastman removed William Walker. Walker was not a hired hand. He was a partner in the invention of the roll holder, the device that let ordinary plate cameras take roll film, patented jointly with Eastman in the mid-1880s. That product had won medals across Europe and built the company's reputation abroad, and Walker had gone to London to run the British operation and stayed for years. In January of 1893, Eastman replaced him with another man, and the London business carried on without him. Into the emulsion department came a portrait photographer from Louisville named William Stuber, who had just spent 6 months in Switzerland learning the technique from a Swiss chemist. He arrived for his interview so certain of the outcome that he brought his family with him. Stuber stayed. In 1925, when Eastman stepped back from running the company he had built, Stuber was the man he named to succeed him. So the pattern is not that Eastman could not keep people. The word he used for what Reichenbach and the others had done was conspiracy. That seems heavy to me for 3 men who wanted to start their own firm, and he never took it back. What Eastman would not tolerate was somebody becoming necessary and then becoming independent. He paid well and promoted fast, and he had funded original research before most of his competitors understood why anyone would. But a man who had been built up inside the company and then looked like walking out with what he knew was not argued with and was not bought back. There is one exception across the whole record, and it is the man who was there before any of them. Henry Strong put money into a dry plate business run by a bank clerk in 1880 and became its president. He was still its president in 1919, with no scientific training and no particular ideas about photography. What he had was money at the beginning, and the sense never to want anything Eastman wanted. Chapter 7. Every film you have ever seen. For most of the 20th century, every moving picture the world watched was printed on material made by one company in New York State. Not most of them, effectively all of them. The transparent film Kodak put on sale in 1889 had been built to solve a problem in still photography. It solved a different one almost immediately. In 1891, working for Thomas Edison, a man named William Dixon designed a camera that could take photographs in rapid sequence. What he needed was a strip of material tough enough to be dragged past a shutter many times a second. It also had to be long enough to hold more than a moment. Nothing like it had existed 2 years before. By March of 1892, Eastman was supplying Edison directly. The width Dixon settled on was 35 millimeters because that was what you got when you took Kodak's stock and cut it down the middle. That measurement became the shape of cinema, and it never changed. Color did not shift it, and neither did sound. And digital cameras today still frame their images to match. A manufacturing convenience at one factory decided the physical proportions of an art form. By 1911, the company was producing over 80 million feet of motion picture stock a year. When the American film companies organized themselves into a trust to control the business, Kodak sat inside it as the supplier of raw material. Every studio in the country bought from the same place, and the patent underneath all of it did not belong to them. In 1887, a minister named Hannibal Goodwin, at a church in Newark, New Jersey, applied for a patent on a method of making transparent, flexible film. He was an amateur, working with chemicals in a room at the back of his parish and trying to build a better way of showing religious pictures to children. By the calendar, he had got there first. The patent office took 11 years to grant it. 11 years is a long time in a young industry. While the application sat in Washington, Kodak coated its first celluloid and sold it to Edison. An entire art form grew up on top of that material, and the company became the largest photographic manufacturer on Earth. Then the patent was issued, and the argument that Kodak had built all of that on somebody else's invention became something a court could hear. The case ran for years after that. In March of 1914, an appellate court found against Eastman Kodak. It was ordered to pay $5 million to the Ansco Company, which by that point held the Goodwin patent. It took a Newark minister and the firm that bought his rights 27 years to win. I doubt many people at the pictures in 1914 had ever heard his name. The material had one further problem, and it was lethal. Nitrocellulose burns ferociously, and it carries its own oxidizer, which means smothering a reel of it does very little. Projection booths through the nitrate era were built as containment rather than as rooms. Metal shutters dropped automatically if the film caught, because a fire in there was assumed rather than feared. Kodak had a safer base almost from the start. An acetate film was announced in 1909 and on sale the year after. The industry would not take it. Acetate was stiffer and harder to splice, and it wore out faster under the mechanical strain of a projector. The studios weighed a difficult product against a dangerous one and kept the dangerous one. It took until 1948 for Kodak to produce a safety base that Hollywood would finally accept. By the company's own count, more than 80 films that won the Academy Award for Best Picture were shot on Kodak stock. Kodak also holds 9 Academy Awards of its own, given for scientific and technical work rather than for anything on screen. None of that is a brand appearing in a film. It is the physical layer underneath every frame of it. The company was in the room for every performance anybody has ever admired and was never once visible. The material has been through nitrate, acetate, polyester, and hundreds of emulsions. The company that makes it has been through everything this film is about to describe. Features are still being shot on it. Chapter 8. The House That No One Inherited. George Eastman had his house cut in half, not a wall taken out. The building itself sawn through. The entire rear section was lifted onto jacks and rolled backwards along temporary track, about 9 feet. That opened a gap in the middle of the house, which was then filled in. The work took 3 months. It reportedly cost more than twice what the whole estate had cost to build in the first place. This was 1919. His architects told him it could not sensibly be done, and he had it done anyway. The reason was a room. The conservatory sat at the center of the house, 2 stories high and glassed over, and it was where he took breakfast. It was also where the organ played. He had an Aeolian pipe organ installed when he moved in, with the console in the conservatory and the pipes rising into the body of the building. A private organist arrived each morning to wake him, and went on playing while he ate. In 1917 he added a second organ, in a chamber above the dining room, so that the sound arrived from 2 directions at once. That was the problem. The conservatory was square. Eastman decided a square room was acoustically wrong, that it wanted to be longer than it was wide, and that the difference was worth pulling a building apart for. Construction had run from 1902 to 1905 on East Avenue in Rochester. He hired a local architect, J. Foster Warner, and brought in William Rutherford Mead of McKim, Mead and White to handle the interiors. Reported room counts vary, but the lowest of them is 37. The build came to around $335,000, somewhere near $9 million today. The size is the least of it. Electricity was generated on site. An internal telephone system ran to 21 stations, so anyone in any room could reach anyone else. Clocks throughout the building were wired to a central network so that all of them agreed. A vacuum cleaning system was built into the walls, and there was an elevator. This was 1905. None of it was decoration. Eastman was a manufacturer who had spent 25 years taking friction out of a process, and he built a house the way he built a production line. Everything in it was a system. The systems talked to each other. When one of them was wrong, he fixed it, and the $300,000 estate got a $100,000 correction because a room was the wrong shape. Cutting a building in half to alter the proportions of one space is not eccentricity. It is a man applying a factory standard to his own life. He moved in with his mother. Maria Eastman had raised him after his father died and had taken in boarders to keep the family going. She lived on East Avenue until she died there in 1907, and by then her son was past 50. He had lived with her his whole life. After that, he was alone in the house for 25 years. The easy reading of that is loneliness. I do not think the evidence carries it. The place was busy. He gave dinners constantly, held concerts in the conservatory, and kept a wide circle around him. Orchids came up in his own greenhouse grown by his own hand. There were cows and chickens on the property because he wanted his own milk and his own eggs. But there was no heir. Eastman never married. There were women in his life, and there was a great deal of speculation, and nothing that came near a marriage. He had no children. A niece existed, and cousins, but there was no son and no daughter, and nobody who was ever going to grow up in those rooms. The house is still standing. Nobody inherited it. In 1949, it opened to the public as a museum of photography, said to be the earliest anywhere. The conservatory is still 9 feet longer than it was designed to be. Chapter 9. The Donor Who Called Himself Smith. Nobody at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology knew who Mr. Smith was. In 1912, the institute was planning to move across the river from Boston to Cambridge, and it did not have the money to build the new campus. Then a donation arrived that made the move possible. $2.5 million on one condition. The donor's name was never to be used. The president of MIT, Richard McLaurin, agreed. In the records, the money came from a man called Smith. Not even the members of the governing corporation were told. For years, the only people who knew were McLaurin, his wife, and his secretary. The mystery became a national entertainment. There is an account in the student paper of 2 New York millionaires having dinner together, each convinced the other was Mr. Smith, circling the subject all evening and getting nowhere. The gifts kept arriving. By the end, MIT had taken close to $20 million from a donor it could not name. In 1920, Eastman finally gave McLaurin permission to say who he was. Plenty of donors ask for anonymity, and most are identified within a year. 8 years of it makes me think he meant it. Over his lifetime, Eastman gave away something in the region of $100 million, which put him among the largest American donors of the era. What separates him from most of the others is that he did it while he was alive, and he built no institution to do it for him. There was no Eastman Foundation. Nobody was employed to process applications. He decided personally, and he wanted a say in how every dollar was spent, and appeals from individuals went unanswered. The largest single beneficiary was the University of Rochester. A school of music went up there, and then a theater to house it, and then a medical school and a school of dentistry. Teeth mattered to him more than anyone expects. Eastman funded dental clinics for children, starting in Rochester and then extending to European cities where Kodak had factories. The reasoning was not sentimental. He had become convinced that untreated teeth in childhood produced sick adults, and that the cost of fixing the problem early was trivial next to the cost of leaving it. He also gave substantial sums to Tuskegee and to Hampton, 2 colleges educating black students in the American South, at a time when very few northern industrialists were doing so. And in 1919, he released 10,000 shares of his own stock, roughly a third of everything he personally held. Kodak employees could buy it at about 17% of its market value. Then, by the late 1920s, something was wrong with his spine. The pain was constant and it worsened. Standing became difficult. His walk shortened into a shuffle, and the distances he could manage kept shrinking. A man who had crossed the Atlantic on a week's notice found the stairs of his own house becoming a calculation. A doctor today would probably call it lumbar spinal stenosis, a narrowing of the canal that carries the spinal cord. There was nothing available in 1930 that would have helped. He had watched this before. His mother spent the last 2 years of her life in a wheelchair. One of his sisters had polio as a child, and used one until she died. He had seen friends lose their faculties well before they lost their lives, and he wrote to one of them about how much that prospect frightened him. On the 14th of March, 1932, Eastman asked a small group of friends to come to the house. He had rewritten his will and needed witnesses. They signed. There was conversation afterwards, and some of it was cheerful. Then he asked them to leave because he wanted to write a note. George Eastman took his own life that afternoon. He was 77. The will left the bulk of what remained to the University of Rochester. Further sums went to the dental clinics. The house on East Avenue went to the university as well, which is how it came to be open to the public 17 years later. He was not buried in a cemetery. His ashes were placed at Kodak Park, under a monument on the industrial site he had spent 40 years building. Chapter 10. 2 musicians in a darkroom. 2 men stood in a completely dark room whistling Brahms. They were not doing it for pleasure. The work in front of them had to be timed precisely, and they could not see a clock. A watch with a luminous dial would have ruined what they were making. So they used the only reliable timing device available, which was the last movement of a symphony they both knew by heart. Leopold Mannes was a pianist. Leopold Godowsky was a violinist, the son of a famous concert pianist. Neither of them was a chemist. They had met at school in New York, and in 1916 they went to a cinema together to see a film advertised as being in color. It was not, particularly. The tints were approximations, and they sat badly on the screen, and the 2 teenagers came out annoyed enough to believe they could do better. That is the kind of thing teenagers say. These 2 spent the next 19 years on it. They worked in kitchens and in rented rooms, funding it out of concert fees. Mannes went to Harvard and studied physics alongside his music. Godowsky went to California, where he played in 2 symphony orchestras and ran experiments between engagements. In 1922, a chance conversation on a ship put Mannes in front of a partner at the investment bank, Kuhn Loeb. The bank sent a young associate to look at what the pair were doing, and he came back impressed. Money followed, and with it a proper laboratory, and, in 1924, patents. And then Kodak. The research laboratories at Rochester had been running since 1912 under an Englishman named Kenneth Meese. He had followed the work of the 2 Leopolds through the 20s. His own staff had coded experimental plates for them, which was already unusual to do for outsiders. In 1930, he went further and put them on the payroll. If I had been running that laboratory, I am fairly sure I would have said no. 2 performing musicians in their early 30s, chasing an idea they had first had as schoolboys, with no formal standing in the field they were about to enter. Meese said yes. Godowsky married George Gershwin's sister, moved upstate with her, and the 2 of them went to work inside the largest photographic company on Earth. The difficulty with color had always been the same. It has to be captured in separate channels and then put back together, and every method of doing that was clumsy. What they built, with a team of Kodak chemists around them, was 1 strip of film carrying 3 layers of emulsion. The layers sat on top of one another, each sensitive to a different part of the spectrum. The color was not in the film at all. It was created during development, chemically, layer by layer. Kodachrome was announced on the 15th of April, 1935. By then, Eastman had been dead for 3 years. That matters more than it looks. The last genuinely unreasonable bet the company ever made was placed by a man Eastman had hired on two people nobody sensible would have hired. It paid off after the founder was in the ground. Everything from here is a company that had the money to do that again and did not. What it produced changed what the century looks like. Color stopped being a specialist process, and within a few years, ordinary people were photographing their own lives in it. The record the 20th century left behind began to resemble the way the 20th century had actually looked to the people living through it. Manis went back to music. He ran the college his parents had founded and sat on the jury of the first Van Cliburn piano competition. Godowsky stayed with the chemistry. Kodachrome remained in production for 74 years. Kodak stopped making it in 2009, and the last laboratory still able to process it closed the year after. Chapter 11. 3 Fights and 3 Defeats. Peter Ueberroth flew to Rochester to sell Kodak something it should have wanted. It was the early 1980s. Ueberroth was organizing the Los Angeles Olympics and selling exclusive sponsorships to pay for them. Photography was Kodak's category, the way soft drinks were Coca-Cola's, and there was no serious alternative supplier in the country. He had set a floor of $4 million. Kodak would not go to one. That was the last of 3 defeats. The first had arrived 30 years earlier and had not looked like a defeat at all. Color film was sold with the developing included in the price. One payment covered both, which meant anyone buying Kodak color was buying Kodak processing whether they wanted it or not. By the early 50s, the company was handling around 90% of color photo finishing in the United States, and it had never once competed for the work. The Justice Department called that an illegal tie. In 1954, Kodak signed a consent decree agreeing to stop. It looked like paperwork. What it did was open a market. Independent laboratories could now process Kodak film, and they did. A firm called Berkey moved into color developing 2 years later, and became, by most accounts, the largest competitor Kodak had in that business. By the end of the 70s, Berkey was handling more of certain film formats than Kodak was. 70 years had gone into making sure nobody could get between the company and its customers. A signature in 1954 let them in, and each of those laboratories was a place a customer could go instead. The second defeat was chosen. Instant photography belonged to Polaroid, and it belonged to them completely. Edwin Land had built a patent position around it that nobody had found a way through. Kodak understood this better than anyone, because between 1963 and 1969, it manufactured Polaroid's instant film for them under contract. In 1976, Kodak launched an instant camera of its own. Polaroid sued within weeks. The case ran 9 years. In 1985, the court found 7 Polaroid patents infringed, and the following year Kodak was ordered out of the business. Then came the part nobody plans for. About 16.5 million Kodak instant cameras had been sold. They were not sitting in a warehouse. They were on shelves and in cupboards in ordinary houses, and the film that fed them was about to stop existing, so the company set up a compensation program. Customers were asked to ring a number and register a camera Kodak had sold them in good faith and could no longer support. Reportedly, the refunds and exchanges ran to hundreds of millions of dollars by themselves. The judgment came separately in 1991, and it ran to close to $1 billion. The third defeat was the cheap one. Fuji had been in the United States since the mid-60s, and selling under its own name since 1972, priced below Kodak. At the start of the 80s, the Japanese company was turning over about $2 billion a year against Kodak's $10 billion. Nobody in Rochester regarded that as a threat, and on the evidence available at the time, nobody was wrong to. Then Ueberroth went to Fuji, and Fuji agreed immediately, and eventually committed around $7 million. Within 30 months of the campaign starting, Fuji was selling 30% more film to Americans than before. Set against a company turning over $10 billion, $1 million is a rounding error, and I cannot make it look like anything other than contempt. Kodak joined the Worldwide Olympic Program in 1986 and paid for the privilege every 4 years until 2008. The sponsorship it had refused at $1 million was never available at that price again. Chapter 12. The 10 years they spent doing nothing. In 1981, a man named Vince Baraba wrote a report. Baraba was Kodak's head of market intelligence. A large retail customer had asked him whether digital photography was something to worry about, and with the chief executive's backing, he ran a serious study of it. He looked at what the technology could already do, and at how fast people take up new things. The report came back with two findings. The first was that digital photography was capable of replacing the film business completely, not supplementing it, replacing it. The second was that it would take about 10 years. So, the company had a decade of notice from its own staff with numbers attached. In 1986, its laboratories built the first megapixel sensor, which Baraba's study had named as the threshold where digital becomes viable. 3 years later, two Kodak engineers, Stephen Sasson and Robert Hills, built the first self-contained digital single-lens reflex camera. It was a professional instrument and it worked. Kodak declined to sell it, because selling it would have damaged film. And in 1996, with the decade gone, Kodak launched a film format. The advanced photo system was good engineering. Loading became foolproof, information was recorded alongside each frame, and one version of the camera could show you a preview of the shot you had just taken. The preview worked because there was a digital sensor inside it. Kodak said $500 million had gone into the system and expected to spend the same again. It was a digital camera engineered to sell film. The stock reached its all-time high in early 1997 at just under $95. Then Kodak did the thing everybody says it failed to do. It went into digital properly. By 2005, it was the largest seller of digital cameras in America, with digital revenue of $5.7 billion, up 40% in a year. That same year, the company lost $1.3 billion. Digital cameras were a bad business, and nobody talks about that. Film had been protected by chemistry. Making it well took decades of accumulated knowledge and an industrial plant that had grown over half a century, and the margins reflected the difficulty. A digital camera needed a sensor and a processor and a lens, and all of them could be bought from somebody else. Anybody could assemble one. Dozens of companies did. By 2001, Kodak was losing about $60 on every digital camera it sold. It was buying market share with money it did not have in a category the telephone would destroy before the decade was out. Antonio Perez took over in 2005. He cut 27,000 jobs and moved manufacturing outside the company, then spent heavily on inkjet printers, betting that ink could become the new film. None of it worked fast enough. In 2011, Kodak's film business made $34 million in operating income. The digital camera division lost $349 million. Then the company began selling patents. A consortium including Apple, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, and Samsung eventually paid around $525 million for the digital imaging portfolio. Much of it had grown out of work done in Rochester in the 70s. On the 19th of January 2012, Eastman Kodak filed for bankruptcy protection. When that year closed, 5,129 employees remained at the company in its own city, which leaves the question of what actually killed it. Kodak did not fail to see digital coming. It saw it a decade early and got the timeline right. It did not fail to build the technology either. Kodak made the first digital camera and the first megapixel sensor, and by 2005 it was outselling every rival in America. What Kodak could not do was find anything that paid like film. Nobody could. Film margins were reportedly around 80%, protected by chemistry that took half a century to learn. There is no version of the last 30 years in which a company built on that keeps earning what it used to earn. The version where a company kills itself with its own invention is a better story than the one the numbers tell, and I understand why it won. What Kodak actually did was spend 30 years defending a business that was going to end, using time it had been told in writing that it did not have. The film coating machines in Rochester run around the clock now. They did not always. For most of this century they ran a single shift, because a single shift was more than enough. The internal question appeared to be how long the lines had left, not how to expand them. Then demand for film started going up, not slightly. Kodak executives have said consumer demand roughly doubled across 5 years, and the company has expanded capacity more than once to keep pace. $60 million went into upgrading the coating operation. Around half the manufacturing workforce was hired within the last few years. Retailers report they cannot keep the stock on the shelves. The buyers are mostly young. That is the part worth stopping on. People who have never known a world without a camera in their pocket are paying money for 36 exposures and a week of waiting. They can take 400 photographs before lunch and delete every one of them. They are buying film instead. They cannot see what they have taken. They cannot fix it afterwards. Most of them will get a few frames back that are simply wrong, and they are choosing that on purpose in a market nobody built for them. Hollywood came back too. Several of the films that took Academy Awards this year were photographed on Kodak film, and a new motion picture stock went into production in the spring. None of that makes this a comeback story, and I want to be careful about that. In 2025, Kodak told regulators it did not have committed financing to cover roughly $500 million of debt falling due. That, the filing said, raised substantial doubt about its ability to continue as a going concern. Those are the words the accounting rules require. They are also the words a business uses when it might not see out the year. What saved it was a pension fund. Kodak terminated its American retirement plan, paid out what it owed to every participant, and took the surplus, which came to something like $767 million. Most of the debt went with it. So the balance sheet is healthier than it has been in years, and the largest division, commercial printing, is still shrinking. Both of those are true at once. There were around 38,000 Kodak retirees when the bankruptcy came, and roughly half of them were still living in Rochester. The city is not what it was. The university is still there, though, along with the School of Music and the medical school. So are the dental clinics that treat children who could not otherwise afford it, and the mansion with a museum inside it. All of it was paid for by a man who wanted to watch the money being spent while he was alive to see it. The calendar is in a display case now. Everything else in this story is finished. The monopoly is gone. The company Eastman built stopped existing in the legal sense, and what came out the other side carries his name and not much else of him. The film survived. Somebody in Rochester is coding it tonight, in the dark. The chemistry goes back to a bank clerk working at his mother's kitchen table 140-odd years ago. In a few weeks, somebody else will buy a roll of it and photograph something they want.